Well, Dr. Amanda Meyer, welcome to the Anatomy and Clay Learning System podcast.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and we are excited to talk about this whole topic, which I came across online recently and found your recent interview about eponyms and dealing with that in terms of the science of anatomy, and we'll get to all that. But first, if you could just set the stage. I know for a fact this is our first international podcast interview with someone from Australia, and we can see your logo there. Can you just set us up, introduce yourself, and tell us where we are talking to you today?
Yeah. Okay, so my name's Dr. Amanda Meyer. I'm an anatomist at the University of Western Australia, which is in Perth. It's on the west coast of Australia. We are the most isolated capital in the world, so it's not surprising that you haven't heard of Perth before or spoken to somebody from Perth. There's very few anatomists here in Perth. My background, I did a Bachelor of Science, majoring in anatomy and physiology and neuroscience. And then I did my honours in anatomy. I did my PhD in physiology, and now I'm actually teaching more neuroscience. So I kind of seem to flip between anatomy, physiology, neuroscience. Wow. So I finished, my PhD, I think 2006. So my PhD is nearly an adult.
Did your whole interest in anatomy start at a young age? Was it high school or earlier? Or?
I was raised on a farm for the first few years of my life. So I was very aware of, dissecting animals for our dinner. I was always fascinated in that. Probably a little bit unusual now thinking about that as an introduction. As I came through my high school years, I was thinking more about becoming a medical doctor. And so the subject choices that I had open to me didn't include human biology. So I had to do maths and physics and English literature and a lot of other different topics. And then it was in my final year of my high school that my grandfather actually died. And I didn't cope with his death very well. And I suddenly thought, I don't think I want to be a clinician having to deal with people dying. And so then that kind of led to somehow me ending up in anatomy, where I'm dealing with dead people who are already dead, and I have absolutely no problem with that. I form my own new relationship with my silent teachers in my lab, and it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable.
Wow, interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you for that and sharing that. Give us a picture of what kind of courses you teach, what kinds of students you have. Are they students heading off to medical careers or related fields, or just give us a picture?
Yeah, that's another great question, because I teach the whole gamut. So I teach gross anatomy, I teach histology, I teach neuroanatomy, I teach neuroscience, and I teach students from first year medical students and first year allied health, so podiatry, dentistry, optometry, and then I teach second year science and neuroscience students, and then I teach master's level neuroscience students, and I also teach, my cat, that's embarrassing.
That's a little reality there, little feline anatomy there, yeah.
Sorry. And yeah, I also teach doctoral students as well who are doing a double doctorate. They're doing a master's in clinical psychology and a doctorate in neurophysiology. So I literally teach first year to first and second year PhD students.
Wow, that is quite the range.
Yeah.
And I assume there's, in terms of careers and where these folks are headed, I assume like a lot of major metropolitan areas, there's a high demand.
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of my students, like I have obviously medical students, science students, neuroscience students. A lot of the neuroscience students are trying to get into medicine. A lot of the science students are trying to get into medicine. And then whoever doesn't really get into medicine then goes on to, optometry, podiatry, dentistry. Very few are unfortunately ending up doing PhDs in the basic science areas like what I did. It's just not as attractive to students at the moment, but there's a massive demand. So I'm not quite sure what is going to happen with a lot of these students. So I am trying to say, we've got a worldwide shortage of anatomists. Come and be an anatomist.
Yeah. Right. How big is University of Western Australia? Is it a big school?
We only have I think 4 universities here in Western Australia, and we take up about a third of Australia, not population wise, but size wise.
Right.
Perth has about 2 million people. And I think, I should have looked this up. I think we've got about 20,000 or so students.
Yeah, big school.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, so it's pretty big. And it's behind, all of those orange roofs behind me, that's UWA.
Yeah. It looks beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
It is gorgeous.
Yeah. So when did this issue of Eponyms first come to you? And if you could, I know you're going to do a better job than I can. Could you just define this really interesting issue with anatomical terms? Can you help us get a definition around it?
Okay, so an eponym is a name given to an anatomical structure which is named after a person. And there is a law that sticks to this, which is called and I've written it down because I butchered saying this on the radio the other day, and I was like, I've said this a million times. So I've written it down this time. It's called NOMENS law, and that was the name that we put our paper on, which was kind of aimed to be a bit controversial. It's called the non-original malappropriate eponymous nomenclature law, so NOMENS law. And that states that no phenomenon or no structure is actually named after its discoverer. And we always thought that eponyms were after the first discoverer. But on digging deeper, a lot of scientists are finding actually scientists 100 years before or a couple of 100 years before found these earlier. And we don't know about the rest of the world. We're only talking about the published white literature that was available in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
Yeah. When did this become an issue for you? How long ago?
I'm trying to think. It was probably about when we published the paper in 2017. So I'd probably been ruminating on it for about 5 years. I'm trying to scratch my head and think about when it did. In my mind, I'm thinking it was probably a Twitter exchange. It was probably at that time, it was probably me talking or shouting it out to the world. Why are we using these eponyms? Because I'd seen, I always have students coming up to me and they're like, which term do we need to know? Do we need to know this term, or both terms? And I would say, well, the Terminologia Anatomica says it's this term, but the book uses both these terms, but your clinicians that you're going to see in 4 or 5 years' time, they're probably going to use this other term. And they're like, but that's so many terms. It's stupid.
Yeah.
So
give us 3 or 4 examples just so we know.
Okay. Let's see what's a good example. Like fallopian tube. Okay, this is a common one. We see it all over the news cycle. Not just sticking to anatomical or physiological textbooks. So the fallopian tube is named after Gabriel Falloppio, but it was actually described by Herophilus and Galen back, BC, or, in the first 100 or 200 years AD. And so why are we calling it after Gabriel Falloppio? Gabriel Falloppio's contributions to anatomy were actually far better in other realms where he wasn't actually given the eponym. Another one is, I know, I'm going to say they all seem to go around the pelvic area. These are the ones that are quite triggering for people.
That's okay. Yeah, they're good. And well, it's particularly ironic with fallopian tube being named after a man. I mean, that's just
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, there's another one, and I wasn't aware of the complete history until I looked it up a couple of weeks ago, and this was about Alcock's canal. And so I'm teaching. I stopped calling it the pudendal canal probably when I first started teaching, only because I'm teaching, very young adults, and every time you say Alcock, you can guess what happens. I'm the mother of 2 teenage boys. You can guess what happens. So I was like, no, pudendal canal. But then, of course, we also have the pudendal canal being, pudendum meaning to shame. And so that's also not exactly great. But I recently found out, and this is through Dr. Mike Cadigan, who is an emergency surgeon, and also I think he's working at Curtin University now. He's got a website called the Eponyms, and he in his spare, I should give you the link for that one. In his spare time, which I suggest is not much, he researches all the backgrounds of all the eponyms. And so he found that the Alcock's canal is actually named after an Irish anatomist who was forced to resign and flee from his job because he refused to illegally procure bodies. And I thought, well, if we're going to keep an eponym, this person was ethically doing the right thing. So maybe, this is where the line gets blurry. Do we now go say, well, maybe Alcock's canal is better than saying pudendal canal? It gets really blurry. Did you want more examples?
Give us one more. Give us one more.
One more. Okay, the bundle of his.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this one particularly sticks in my throat. Firstly, because students go, his, that means of God. And I'm like, well, no, actually, it's Wilhelm His. And he was a Nazi person who did a lot of awful experiments on people. So was a supporter of eugenics. And in 2023, particularly, that's not acceptable. It doesn't go. So that's one that I think should be absolutely struck off the list of eponyms. So we'll just call it, the atrioventricular bundle. That tells us where it is as well.
Yeah. Yep. And I'm sure you look back on your own education, your own years coming up through college and doing your graduate work and everything, and you were using these terms.
I was.
Yeah.
Because it didn't trigger anything right then because we didn't know the history. It wasn't in our textbooks. And so we just accepted that was the term because that was in our textbooks and that's what our professor was using. We never questioned. It was just like, what do we need to know for the exam?
Yeah.
Like my students now.
Right. So what has the reaction been? Has it been favorable? Are you getting some negative pushback?
Oh gosh, it's been a wave. It's been a really interesting wave. So because of course, who's your Twitter circle or your Twitter followers is probably a very curated list. And so when I first popped it out into the universe, it was celebrated because most of the anatomists that I consult with on Twitter, we're all very like-minded. And so it was a celebration of, yes, let's be more inclusive. Let's move anatomy into the 21st century. And then it kind of went away. And then I got, as we say, I don't know if you say this in the US, I got a bee in my bonnet. And I just had this ticking thought in the back of my mind. I'm like, I have to write this paper, and I need to find people who are just as passionate and ready and willing to take on the fight. And that's when I contacted Margaret McNulty, who's at the Indiana School of Medicine. And so she's an associate professor there. And she had a PhD student, or still does, Rebecca Weisner, and we got together. And it was in a very short time that we wrote our paper. I had all the papers sitting there. We split it into 3, and we just went, these are our 3 sections, let's hit it. And I wrote my section I think in one night. It was such a passionate thing that I finally got off my chest. And it was just so brilliant to write. I think it was one of the best writing experiences that I've had in my whole career. It was just a really nice division. Everyone was clear. Everyone was in unison with what our goal was. When it went to the reviewers, that's when it got a bit interesting, because then we started getting feedback, and they're like, this seems really pointed at white males. You shouldn't put nomens in the title. And there was quite a bit of pushback. But we put our foot down and we said, no, we want this to be slightly controversial, because we want to push our agenda. We want to get this discussion out into the open. And so I think our paper was published in, I think, July of 2021. And so we're nearly 2 years later, and we're finally talking about it. So this is what I say, it comes in waves. So we published our paper. Then I think there was a pushback from, I think it was a medical student or a master. I think there was a medical student, I think in the University of Glasgow, hit back and said, no, we should keep using eponyms. All our clinicians use them. We need to be able to speak to them. We need to know and use their language. So we should absolutely keep them. And then I think about a week later or 2 weeks later, another paper came out. But this was from Jason Organ and Jason Mussel, the 2 Js. And Jason's obviously the editor of Anatomical Sciences Education now. He wasn't at that point. And him and the Jasons got together and talked about how we could kind of flip the conversation and it not be just about erasing white men's names from anatomical terms. We should actually be using this as an opportunity to talk about the ethics, and this is how we can bring in bioethical discussions into our classroom. So I think that's a really great thing to do as well. So I'm all for doing that. So I think that was a really nice addition. So there was kind of these 3 quick papers in succession to our paper, and then it went quiet.
Yeah. That's the trough of the wave, I guess, is what you're saying. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I guess the question might be, what would it take to get there? To eradicate is probably too strong a word, but to change it over. I was thinking about this in terms of something like a computer. If you had scientists from around the world getting together to discuss all the parts inside a computer, you would need to have the same terminology around all these different parts, or a jet engine or something. You wouldn't have one set of jet airplane engine experts in one part of the world suddenly naming the turbine after somebody who developed the turbine. And, it is just what it is.
Yes. I think I totally agree. And this is the problem we're facing.
So what would it take? What would it take?
What
How do
would
we
it
get
take?
there?
It would take clinicians to get on board, and I think that's going to be the hardest one, the hardest problem to deal with, because we did a recent study and it found that 70% of clinicians still want us to teach eponyms. So I think
What about academics?
I think academics, I was going to say the Gen X generation, so my generation and down, millennials. And so I think that won't be a problem getting us to change eponyms. I think it'll be more our older, I hate saying that term, our older academics who might have more of a pushback. And we see the same with the clinicians, clinicians who've been clinicians for over 21 years are much more likely to use eponymous terms compared to clinicians who are only less than 5 years out. So I think we've got a very long way to come in changing our clinicians' terminology. And I think that might just be a generation thing that might wear out over a generation. I'm not 100% certain on that. But the other thing is textbooks, because the textbooks are always going to be our reference literature. And I'm currently editing a book and having this same debate with the other editors. I'm saying we should remove the eponyms, and they're saying, no, we've got to keep the eponyms. So I think our compromise is going to be that in this book that we will present both, because we're trying to keep everyone happy.
So you'll have the eponym and then maybe the scientific name in parentheses, or?
I want to have the proper scientific name, the TA name first in bold, and then in the brackets, I would actually like it to say eponym and then put the eponym there. So students reading it are well aware that it is an eponym.
Yep. How many, I should have asked this earlier, but how many total, do we know how many total eponyms there are in the human anatomy system?
Oh, well, it depends on which version of the Terminologica Anatomica, because they completely started removing them, I think, in 1895. And then in 1956, they called for them to be completely scrapped. And so if you scroll through the Terminologica Anatomica now, there's not that many eponyms in the TA. But when I say that, it's only anatomists, and probably only a few anatomists, that are constantly referring to that Terminologica Anatomica. The rest of them and other educators and clinicians are probably just using textbooks, which are full of them.
Yeah.
So thousands.
Yeah. What about this issue? I mean, I assume in China, in Japan, in India, and there's human anatomy everywhere around the world. Doesn't matter where you go. They don't say fallopian tube, do they? Or did they?
I'm thinking they do, because I had an Indian anatomy educator contact me a few months ago and said, oh, I didn't know that was an eponym. With something that I used. So I don't know if it's continent specific. I think it's everywhere. I think it's because of the textbooks getting everywhere. I think it's just been incorporated into common language.
Yeah. So is there any formal organization to the campaign, or is this a kind of ad hoc committee that anybody wants to join and be part of the voice to get the word out?
Yep, I think it's more of the second. So there are certain groups working within the IFAA, so that work on terminologies, but they are not the groups that are pushing to get rid of eponyms. I'm not aware of many other people that are pushing as hard as we are. When I say we, I mean Margaret McNulty, Rebecca Wisner, Jess Byram, myself. We are pushing particularly hard because we're a little bit older and we are not too afraid of rocking the boat. A lot of younger academics have expressed hesitancy in voicing their opinion to support removing eponyms, and they're very mindful of wanting to support the students, and they are fearful that if they don't teach the students the eponyms, that once they get into clinical rotation, that they will be looked down upon by their clinicians, because if they, talk about the bundle of His or the ampulla of Vata, and they don't know what that is, that they won't be able to work out what the clinician is talking about, because those terms are not descriptive.
Gotcha. Do you bring this up with your students and talk about this as an issue, and what's their reaction?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So my students are really, really great, because I talk about it and I've given them the whole history of it and why I'm doing it, because I want to be more inclusive. And I have a very diverse cohort ethnicity-wise in my students. So I want to be as open and transparent as I can. So I think most of them are on board with that. I think it's more my colleagues in different areas within the university who are not anatomists, and they still persist using those terms because it's in the textbooks, and they say, well, we default to the textbooks use them. So it's going to be a hard push to keep doing that. I think the best bet is to try and, I guess, get those textbooks converted. Then hopefully we'll get the older generation to accept it, or we wait it out and the boomer generation retire. Suddenly Gen X, are writing the script, and then we get the non-eponymous terms in, and then the clinicians, will eventually get there. I'd love to see it in my lifetime. I'm in my mid-40s. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I would love to see it.
Yeah. Well, it is a serious issue. It could be, I could see how you could, say, I've got other things to worry about than this. It's not, life or death maybe, but in some ways it is an ethical issue around what does the, as a group of scientists who come around one issue, what do we agree on should be the process? And it's okay to go back through our previous practices and say that, for centuries we did something one way, and it's for these good reasons, it's probably time to change, and let's go back. I mean, I think in our country, there's a lot of, questions about our own approach to all sorts of different social justice issues, which are being highlighted all the time. And this is in some ways no different.
I totally agree. I would love to hear your thoughts. How do you think we should move forward, Mark?
Well, and I am a complete, layman here. I only know a little bit about human anatomy from helping Anatomy-INCLAY with their media relations and communications and various public relations efforts. And, with campaigns like this, which involve reaching a global audience and all the different, like you say, textbooks and magazine articles and papers being published and papers being presented at conferences. And I think about all the classrooms the lights will flip on tomorrow in all the classrooms around the world where anatomy is being taught. And it's one thing to talk about what's on the printed page. It's another thing to change our oral language. And I do think some of that is a matter of seeing another generation come along. But I think it's personally, as one individual, I shouldn't say I'm speaking for all of Anatomy-INCLAY, which is led by the very fabulous John Zahorik, and he has his very specific views about how anatomy has been taught. My long preamble to say my personal belief is when you talk about the bundle of His and the story there, that is reason enough for me to say that we shouldn't be uttering his name. He doesn't deserve that kind of legacy in any way, shape, or form, nor does Mr. Fallopio. So let's I think it would be great to see some informal organization come around this and say, let's really make this a much more visible initiative. But that's just my opinion.
Would love that.
Yeah.
I would really love that.
Yeah.
I think you've made a great point, is that to this point now, it has been an ad hoc, Twitter ramblings, Twitter musing, retweets, a couple of papers. We haven't been able to formalize this movement. And I think maybe that is the next step. And then maybe that will start to convince textbook authors and journal editors and reporters and clinicians to get on board.
Yeah. Maybe a pledge, some sort of pledge, and even just to demonstrate we have X thousand who've signed the pledge, and pass it along, sign the pledge. And here are 3 steps every anatomy instructor, every clinician. There might be some clinicians that 20%, if you get the 20% of clinicians on board, and even just around that common language, international common language, being able to, when the time comes to discuss terms in the same, off the same songbook, so to speak. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this has been this has been a really, really interesting rundown. And before I let you go, is there anything else I haven't asked you that you'd like to just chime in?
I think that is about it. It's early here, so my brain is not 100% firing. But it's lovely. Thank you so much for asking me to do this interview. It's such an important topic, and I'm loving that it's back in the news. And hopefully, I really like those ideas about the pledge and getting those 3 points that we can help people. I think that's something that we can easily implement and get working. So thanks, Mark. That's been brilliant. Just the spark I needed.
Well, what a pleasure chatting with you. I wish you all the best, and maybe we'll check in with you again down the road.
Thanks very much for having me.